So a very warm welcome to our latest quarantine call. The purpose of Quarantimes is to help people come together to understand what is changing in the world and how Europeans can cope with this new reality. Very excited to be joined this week by Ann Linde, the Swedish Foreign Minister. And we're absolutely thrilled that Ann Linde has joined us to help us make sense of that. She's had a long career in politics and foreign policy in the Social Democratic Party. She was leading the Swedish Social Democrats' international policy even before she became minister, and then was State Secretary of the Justice Minister. She was Minister for Trade and Nordic Cooperation, and since last year has been the Swedish Foreign Minister. But as well as her enormous experience within Sweden, she stands for a government that has charted, I think, a particularly unique and interesting course through this crisis, which has attracted a lot of international attention. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the Minister, who's going to speak for about 10 minutes about how you see the corona world, about the path that Sweden's charting domestically, but also how Sweden can be a force for European and international cooperation.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm honored to be able to speak to you. I've seen some of your quarantine talks, and it's really interesting. And I might as well start by addressing the debate whether or not Sweden is going against the grain when it comes to managing the COVID-19. We have the same strategic goals as every other country, and that is to saving life, slow down the outbreak, ensure that the Swedish healthcare system will cope with the extraordinary challenges, and mitigate the effects on business and jobs. Our strategy is based on social distancing, staying in home even with the slightest symptoms, and protecting older and risk groups. This is done by a mixture of strong recommendation and legally binding measures. And people are following recommendation to a high degree. They know this is not kind of some tips that you can follow if you want to or not. As one example, during the Easter holiday travels to the most popular vacation destination, travel went down with 96%. It's a fact that the trade and our economy has been severely hit, and the unemployment numbers are very worrying. So no, it's not business as usual in Sweden, and we are not cautious about the pandemic. In Sweden, we have a slightly different governmental structure with small ministries and large autonomous agencies. That is dating back centuries. There locally is a high degree of trust in the state and the autonomous agencies and scientific advisors. We are used to listen to the scientific advice from our expert authorities and mostly follow them. One reason is that corruption is very low. People rightly believe that the recommendations is not because of political or economical favors to those that give the advice. We do know that the virus is highly contagious, and high quality healthcare helps. We do not know enough about mutations, immunity, second waves, or the long-term benefits of lockdowns, or not. In sum, we should be humble to different national strategies and focus on cooperation. Let me move on to the long-term discussion. Although we are in the middle of the immediate crisis, with grave consequences for life and healthcare and economic downturns at hand, we need to keep an eye on the important geopolitical trends and the long-term impact of COVID-19. There are three major trends we can now see in what we can only be described as the worst pandemic of our time. First, with hundreds and thousands of deaths and national lockdowns, we are seeing a dramatic economic assessment from the IMF, WTO, ECB, and our national ministries of finance. The level of newly acquired debt, the number of bankruptcy, and the high unemployment numbers both at home and in Europe, and especially in the US, risk growing even stronger. Secondly, I believe the critique of multilateral cooperation is damaging to our societies, and the confrontational rhetoric between the US and China is most problematic. We have seen trade wars, threats of decoupling, and blame games. All of this is highly damaging for the multilateral cooperation, and that needs both those countries to cooperate in order to work. The United Nations Security Council is blocked, and the WHO are caught up in geopolitics. Similarly, we do not have the luxury of putting other pressing issues on hold, such as climate change, poverty reduction, food, water or air security, migration, disarmament, and antimicrobial biological resistance. And don't forget regional tensions in the Levant, the Gulf, Yemen, Afghanistan, or South China Sea. Thirdly, the European Union must play a central role now and after the end of the immediate pandemic is over. All EU member states have implemented some degree of limitations to personal freedom as a consequence of the COVID-19. This is natural and important, and it's a political move, but I fear that these steps have also taken as an excuse for some countries, including EU member countries, to take political decisions that would normally undergo parliamentary scrutiny in a way that now is impossible. It's also a fine line between self-sufficiency and protectionism, and suddenly we are talking of autonomy in Europe. I fear this is a slippery slope. We cannot abandon free trade, as this would hurt us all economically and also the lives of Europeans everywhere. Looking forward, I see no true winners from this crisis, only relative losers. I fear the world is increasingly moving in the direction of the greater fragmentation, something we must counter. I also fear it will take time to retake what has been lost in democracy, free trade and liberties, but I do not see this as an end of globalization. It is a fact that no one center of power, be it China, US, EU or India, can alone lead, much less dominate the world today in any area. Only by coming together will we be able to create momentum and produce global change. And that is why we would need today in monitoring, managing, and curing this current threat. In recovery, the EU must make the case actively that democracy and high normative standards are good for stability, security, and economic growth, even as we grapple with the current crisis. We must be clear about what is good, the bad, and the ugly. We need to keep the EU together. We need to maintain strong relations with the US, not only for transatlantic security, on which we are all dependent, but also the US key role in multilateral institutions, and as the key guardian of democracy, human rights, and freedoms. I had, for example, a long and constructive talk with my American counterpart, Secretary Pompeo, a few weeks ago. We also need a decent dialogue with countries we do not always agree with, including Russia and China. We need them on board, and we need them to be part of the global solution. Today before this meeting, we had a meeting with the Council of Baltic Sea States, and my colleague, Mr. Lavrov, took an active and constructive part in this afternoon's discussions. But also within Europe, we need to work together with like-minded to maintain high standards and develop pragmatic cooperation. For Sweden, we see the Nordics and the Baltic as a family, and we feel a close affiliation to the values and interests of several other European countries, not least Germany. However, I hope that this crisis makes us more compassionate and that preventive measures from democracy to health and security will gain new acceptance. I hope that we use this crisis for investment in retaining and sustainable solutions. I hope that the e-commerce, the healthcare, the technology will be seen in a new light. When we look back, we will probably see this crisis as a catalyst for digitalization and automation. As I said in the meeting in Davos, synthetic biology, AI, additive manufacturing, nanotech and quantum solutions will have a huge impact on our societies and our completeness. This is not the end of globalization, and commodities and businesses will still be global, but it will be different. We shall see what kind of impact today's decrease in trade and consumption will have on employment and human skills. Oil prices are important, as are the vulnerabilities in supply chains, not least when it comes to the pharmaceutical drugs and food. This crisis affects all, but we are not all affected in the same way. We must tackle the current and immediate crisis, but it would be a shame if we lost sight of the important and long-term democracy, human rights, international law, and free trade. In conclusion, now is the time for humility and realism. Now is the time for cooperation, compromise, and common vision. Yes, this is really a bad crisis, but what good can we make of this? As Sun Tzu said, in the midst of chaos, there is always an opportunity. How do we make our economies more competitive? How do we today prove solidarity and neighborly love in times of hardship? How do we maintain and promote the forces of democracy, equality, and freedom within our own region? How can we engage and connect the United States, China, India, and Russia to jointly tackle the bigger issues of our time? These issues and many others must be at the forefront as we start to return to normality and recovery.